Hi everybody, this is Mr. Yeoman again, and today what we're talking about is self-sustaining mechanisms. So we know that ecosystems have been here long before humans are around. They'll probably continue long after humans are gone, but we need to take a look at some of the major components of what allows them to do that. So a few major words or phrases that we need to keep in mind is, first of all, homeostasis. And if you think back to your introductory biology class, what homeostasis is just maintaining a balance. So we are constantly maintaining a balance of a lot of different things inside of our body. So water, if your water gets too low, then you stop urinating, you stop sweating. If you have too much water, then you try to release that excess water. You try to excrete it. That works with a lot of different things. So looking at like salts, our temperature, those are things that we try to maintain in a certain balance. We're going to take a look at what natural succession is. So how do we go from non-living to living areas on land, and how that continues to change over time. And then evolution, how do those systems change? And then the last part of there is how are we impacting those ecosystems? So looking at this quote by William Shakespeare. "And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." So he's just relating back to nature being an important influence for him as a writer, and other writers as well. Okay, so enough of an intro there. Just kind of gave you a bit of a review on what homeostasis is. So homeo meaning the same and stasis being staying. So literally translated, staying the same. So we were talking about homeostasis as individuals, but we also have homeostasis as entire ecosystems. So in some situations, like in natural systems, predator-prey relationships help maintain homeostasis. You don't want too many members at the low end of the system, and you don't want too many members at the high end of the system. So you don't want too many predators, don't want too many prey, because no matter what, it's going to upset the balance. And so those predator-prey relationships are very delicate, which is why if we mess those up, then we can have a lot of repercussions from that. So different things that affect ecosystem homeostasis, there are really two of them. There's growth factors and there are reduction factors. So things that allow things to increase in population or things that allow living things to reduce their numbers. And those can be both living or non-living. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that can affect ecosystem balance. So on the top there, I have reduction factors. That's why there is an arrow pointing down. So living things that affect ecosystem balance are things like predators. So the more predators you have, the fewer organisms you have at the bottom of the food chain. Disease, if you have a disease that comes through, it could wipe out a large section of the food chain, just like what we have had recently with birds and with pigs, that we had a large number that got wiped out because of illnesses. Parasites, something else that we don't typically see a lot of in the Western society, or we don't think of a lot in Western cultures, but they do exist. Competitors, so maybe not trying to fight a hunter, but trying to fight other organisms who live in a similar niche as you. So trying to, find shelter, mates, whatnot, so that can affect our numbers. And then lack of food or lack of suitable habitat. Those are items that can reduce the amount of appropriate living space, and so numbers of a population can go down. So non-living things that can affect us are unfavorable weather. So a few years ago we had a really, really cold winter. The deer population dropped significantly because it was so cold that some of them just couldn't survive. So that would be unfavorable weather. There's a lack of water. All organisms need water, so that would be an issue. And then chemical changes, and that's one that ends up being a result of us many times. So chemical changes like introducing industrial waste into an environment that can affect the numbers of individuals that live there. So there are lots of other things that are human-centered, and we can talk about what those might be later on. Now, on the growth side, there are just as many things that increase populations as decrease. So a high reproductive rate, if you have organisms that reproduce very, very quickly and have lots of offspring, that can make populations grow quickly. An ability to adapt, and that's really just evolution. An ability to migrate, so if there's a problem and they can go somewhere else, that might be a benefit. If they're able to compete better in one location over another, that could help them survive. So camouflage, defense, finding food, all of these things are important to survival. But non-living things that could affect it, so favorable light. Some places need a lot of light. Some places actually require, so like certain plants, if you have too much light, it can damage them. Usually that ends up being an issue of dehydration. If there's too much light, it's probably getting too hot, and then it's not a suitable condition for it to survive. If there's a favorable temperature, so again, if it's too hot, too cold, that can be an issue for certain types of plants or animals as well. And then favorable chemical environment, so looking at things like pH, whether or not there are chemicals in the water. We think of chemicals as being a bad thing. There are actually some chemicals that could improve the conditions for a certain organism. So if it's resistant to a certain chemical but other organisms are not, then they're really competing unintentionally with these other organisms. Now, we have an arrow going down, we have an arrow going up, and what this is really doing is saying that they're going to balance out, hopefully, so that the reduction factors are going to equal the growth factors eventually. If it doesn't, then the ecosystem will eventually collapse. So most organisms have a certain amount of environmental resistance, and so over here on the side, I have some examples, or an example of what unchecked growth factors would look like. So a lot of times we think of these reduction factors as bad, and a lot of times I hear people talk about, oh, you know, something died, and that's a bad thing. It's like, I agree with you to an extent that that's hard. When organisms die, somebody brought up the idea of a deer trying to cross a river, and it couldn't make it across the Mississippi. It got tired and it drowned. And as harsh as that is, that is part of nature, and so that reduction factor actually helps other organisms survive. So I'm not trying to be, you know, unsympathetic to that idea, but we do need to understand that this is a whole balance. And so when people say, oh, you know, that animal's killing another animal, it's like, that's what it does to survive. So we need to keep that in mind. But over here on the side, we're looking at a prairie vole, which is a small mammal. It looks a lot like a mouse. It looks like a big mouse. If it was under ideal conditions, which the list of conditions are relatively long, so it's like being at just above freezing, having like 18 hours of light a day, you know, all these different conditions. The prairie vole could have a litter of 7 pups every 3 weeks for several years if those conditions remain the same. Now here's the issue. Prairie voles can live around here in Iowa, and we don't have those conditions. It doesn't stay at right around freezing, and we don't have 18 hours of sunlight all year long, so that's not going to happen. But that just brings us to the idea that reproduction is usually less than optimum. So these growth factors are inhibited by certain things. Just the season changes make them less likely to survive. Okay, so ecosystems change frequently. They fluctuate a lot. So things like rainfall and weather, those do affect all species, but you can have wet years, you can have dry years, and that will tend to change over time. As populations increase, then the predators that feed on those organisms also tend to increase. And what that does is it helps keep the ecosystem in check. So if there's more rabbits, generally there's more foxes, there's more predators that are going to eat those rabbits, so that the population, even though it goes up briefly, in the long run it stays in check. So that is constantly changing. And the last one, the ability of an ecosystem to recover from temporary changes is referred to as resilience. Okay, many ecosystems are resilient, but once you get to a certain point, they can't bounce back. And so some of these things, they will bounce back, but it takes a long time an oil spill in Alaska, the Exxon Valdez. If we take a look at that, that is kind of an extreme example. It happened decades ago, and that ecosystem is still recovering. It is recovering, but it's taking a very, very long time to do that. It's one of the same issues that they have in the Gulf. So we have the Gulf oil leak there, and there's still some changes that need to occur. And even though we know that it will eventually go back, it doesn't take as long as it does in the Arctic, but it does take time for that ecosystem to bounce back. All right, so just a quick review from introductory biology. These are pyramids showing the predator-prey relationship. So over here, we have plants down the bottom. That's what we refer to as producers. Those are eaten by exclusive herbivores. So in this case, I believe they are grasshoppers. The grasshoppers are eaten by rodents. The rodents are eaten by snakes, and the snakes are eaten by a peacock. Okay, just one example. Here's another ecosystem. So you have your producers down here at the bottom. So algae, plants, they're eaten by your fish, or in this one, there are fewer steps in here. And then as we go up, you just keep getting higher and higher in the food chain, but there are fewer and fewer organisms. And the reason for that is because energy is lost in each step. So you're not going to have a large number of organisms at the top of your chain. Okay, so this is a picture of something called the dead zone. This is something that is a result of human behavior. And honestly, this is a lot of Iowa and Midwest behavior. So we can impact a lot of organisms downstream from us. Now, these impacts can be minor, they can be severe, but it really depends on the amount and how do we deal with that. The amount of chemicals that are leaked or the amount of material. So sewage leaks, we have a lot of hog confinements. If those pigs poop, that has to go somewhere. So a lot of times farmers will hold them in large tanks. Well, if that tank is leaking, that can get into our water supply. And if it's just a little bit, it can be pretty easily fixed. But if there's a lot of it, you can have a lot of wildlife that dies from that. Sometimes refer to that as a fish kill. And so that a lot of fish downstream end up dying because there's too much waste in the water. So if that happens once, it's not a big deal. But if it's happening over and over again, it can become a pretty serious issue, and that resilience of that ecosystem can be strained. So recovery times may be measured in hundreds of years. So sometimes we might be talking about weeks or months. Other times we're talking about decades. Or if we're talking about like nuclear waste, that can be measured in hundreds of years. So that's a long time. So the picture that I have above here is something called the dead zone. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video for a second, and I'd like you to do a little bit of research on what the dead zone is. So if you just go into Google and type in the dead zone, you'll probably get a few different things. There's a TV show, you might get something about cell phone reception, but what you're really looking for is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And what I'm going to ask you to do is read about that and give some of your ideas about the causes of that dead zone and what's going on. I do have some posters that I'm going to bring over and have you take a look at, but I want you to think about what's happening in that dead zone and what are the long-term possible consequences of this continual dead zone that keeps occurring in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and pause the video at this point, do some research, and then bring back, I'm going to have you write out a response, answer some questions on Schoology.